All right.
I will point out from the CFP tracker that we do have OpenSSF Day. Its CFP is coming up and closing end of this week. So we should probably, if anyone's going to submit talks to that, should probably really get going.
Okay.
It looks like Frederick has something in the works there. By no means does that mean that other people can't or shouldn't put talks in as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then so that sounds good. And then for RustConf, I raised this last week. I learned from MITRE that the CFP itself will have to go through public release, which is mildly annoying. So
I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right. So that is the one sort of question mark on getting the submission in on time. It's just like got to finish writing it, and then it's actually got to go through some review, which it depends. Sometimes those take a few days, and other times they drag on for weeks, just depending on people's responsiveness. So, we'll see.
No, I understand. It's you do appear to have solved the how do I participate in an open source problem, but the talk problem is a different problem entirely.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes people are more sensitive, although hopefully there's a little bit of MITRE of what I've seen in other large organizations, which is after you turn that crank a couple of times, the people whose job it is to gatekeep kind of get sick of you. Like, look, you're responsible. We've never regretted it. You've never made us embarrass us in public. Now this is just work. How about you just keep behaving in public?
Yeah, there is actually a formal thing to basically get that, and you get sort of like a fast track approval if you've got a history of essentially not causing problems.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's relatively new. I think there's only a few people in the company right now that actually have that approval, mm-hmm. But it seems good. So all right, let's see which one of these. Yeah. All right. Oh yeah, and I think I actually made the note here about last week.
Yep.
All right. Let's see. Build tool, community outreach. Anything new here?
I don't think anything has changed here.
Yeah. No, I this all seems the same. All right, and then do we have anything to talk about for the blog post? I feel like I know this has been here sort of as an open thing for a little while.
I don't think so. Not currently, no.
All right. Well, then we can forge ahead to talk about spec stuff.
Well, really quickly, I do want to make sure that we also put out the call if there's anybody who has POCs they want to show or implementer questions, just to make sure that now that we're no longer alternating back and forth, that we do actually leave space for our tool builders.
Oh, fair. All right, hearing none, let's proceed. So, all right, so the introduction for the spec, Ed, I think I saw that you had made a couple of comments.
I had started to comment on it. I had not gotten all the way through commenting on it. There were a couple of places where you would clearly would have been done in reformats, which is fine. And some of those were really obvious at a glance reformats. Like I think there was some place where you sucked the number of dashes on a line down to 3, which is the what you need for a break in markdown. And then there were some others where you had done what was just a reformat, but the diffs ended up being the entire flipping file. So I went through and I actually that's the looks like basic reformatting to me. I actually went through with some care to make sure that it was basic reformatting for the most part.
All right, cool.
Because I know that when I see something like that, I always get a little bit nervous, at least in my own writing, that I may have changed something substantive by mistake. So I thought I would check that.
Yeah. The one place where I feel like the formatting had to be changed a little bit more, I say they had to. So GitHub flavored Markdown and Common Mark, so neither of them actually support an extension for definition lists, which we actually been using. It's supported by some other flavors of Markdown, but it's just sort of like not supported by the Markdown implementations we're actually using. So which is unfortunate because I think definition lists are great, but I changed the one spot we were using them. I changed it to just an unordered list with the the terms being defined in bold and then a colon and then the definition.
Mhm, mhm. Sounds
Um,
good.
Yeah, okay, so this was a sort of open point of discussion. In my draft, I had sort of opted for input manifest. But I think in my initial notes on like terminology that the discussions post, I think I'd said it artifact input manifest. What was, I'm trying to go back and like remind myself what was the actual
It's it's not a
argument.
huge, it's not an enormous deal, but it has a couple of for example, talking about the aim is a lot better than talking about the im. You're
Yeah,
talking about the artifact input manifest. There's a certain amount of symmetry around it.
My
Right.
comment on that was I didn't see what the word artifact was adding to it. And,
Mhm.
and it made it a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not exactly what the artifact was referring to. Is it referring to the inputs as artifacts, or is it referring to the thing that the manifest is describing as an artifact? Or is it both? And
Mhm.
also, since I have this other proposal that we use the same file for also describing outputs, I think we want to be able to just talk about manifests. And an input manifest is a specific kind of subset of manifests, which only refers to inputs and can be embedded. And then
Mhm.
the artifact is just another word. And unless we need to, like, it would be nice to avoid abbreviations. So if the term is short enough that you don't need to abbreviate it, then that's kind of good.
Well, but part of the thing is manifest is used quite broadly. And so it helps to know which manifest you're talking about. It's sort of like if if you've ever had the misfortune of dealing with too many projects that work with one another that use year, month, versioning. Oh, particularly with when they use each other, but they don't talk about each other very often. Oh yeah, I know. So does 2204 support 2204 with 2201? No, just no. Very bad. And so I could imagine talking about, for example, a situation where you have, say, a manifest file that you're using for Kubernetes, and then you've got the artifact input manifest, and you're trying to interleave them in conversation, and being able to cleanly distinguish them is sometimes useful.
You mean across different projects, or like cargo manifests versus OmniBOR manifest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is manifest the term that's used for cargo?
manifest is the term that Cargo uses internally for the
Okay.
cargo.toml file.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, those are things we would not want to confuse. I mean, it also gets to because effectively, I would imagine from my big recollections poking in Rust, some of what's in in that manifest is in fact, crate inputs to the build. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, you describe the dependencies. So it's describing inputs to the build at the level of the sort of package rather than at the level of specific files, as we would be doing with OmniBOR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's rather than sort of specific artifacts. It's the crates or packages. Okay. Do other folks have thoughts or opinions?
I'll say this is one where I don't feel strongly about it. I think artifact input manifest was my original idea, and that was in part just the symmetry with artifact identifier and artifact dependency graph. I suppose it does sort of hang on this question of whether we intend the manifest to describe other things, or if we anticipate there being other manifests and we want to sort of disambiguate between them. I think the point about, potentially caring about like disambiguating between the manifests for this project and manifests for other projects, relevant as well.
So I'm happy to come. So I think that basically we've got a couple of different choice points in here, and in one of them is whether or not we have the artifact modifier on an input manifest. Then I think, Jeremy, you have questions as to whether or not you want input as a modifier on manifest. Is that correct?
Yeah, like I think if we're going to have external metadata as a supported mode, or then we need to put the output somewhere as well, and these manifests seem to be the obvious place to do that. In fact, probably the only place you could do that. And so you are going to have manifests. If that's the case, you're going to have manifests with a mixture of inputs and outputs. So input would just be wrong and confusing as a term for that. I mean, the word artifact, I don't mind. It just seems extraneous to me. Like I don't think it's particularly like if you were trying to disambiguate these manifests from some other manifests, then you just call this an OmniBOR manifest. I would have thought you'd qualify it with the project name. You don't need to give it an internally distinct name just to disambiguate.
Okay, let's go look at some of the rest of these things. I think we should probably come back to some of this because in part, I'm a little bit behind Jeremy on digesting some of your thoughts. And I think digestion of those is sort of critical to understanding your point in the fullness. Oh no, I meant like, yeah, it may make sense to walk through some of what you've done here beyond just the comments that have been added here. Andrew, I guess my point, because you did a lot of rewrite, which is quite frankly a massive improvement. And you did a certain amount of file shuffling, which I also understand. And I think is an improvement overall. But shall we go take a look at some of what you changed?
Yeah, sure. So I think looking at it as individual commits is perhaps the easiest
yes.
Option. So the first, and this was just, formatting stuff. And I tried to, with each of these, to give comments explaining each item that was changed. So this one was just fixing things like using the correct bare links syntax, getting rid of the non-standard definition list syntax, things like that, sort of like changing some of the link formatting, doing the hard wrapping of the lines, removing double spaces after periods, and then some minor grammatical stuff.
You break my heart. I'm a double spacer. I understand, but you break my heart.
And I will say, like, it's less even about having a particular view on whether that's right or wrong. It was just that we were only doing it in a few places in the document, and so just wanted to standardize it.
But now you forced me to ask Oxford comma.
Yeah, I would generally include the Oxford comma. Yes. I think otherwise you leave open some ambiguities that don't need to be ambiguous.
I'm something of an Oxford comma absolutist. I don't consider it to be a question of whether or not one would like to have an Oxford comma. It's just a question of correct or incorrect.
Yeah. So I feel like this commit, maybe we don't need to necessarily run through in detail, because it really was just about making some formatting changes. You can see here, fixing up some capitalization.
And thank you so much for breaking this up by commits this way. It makes it enormously easier to review. It also makes me vaguely nostalgic for Garrett.
Oh, yeah.
Because Garrett handles this kind of breakup much more gracefully.
Yeah, it does. GitHub, it's it's sort of like you can technically go into the commits tab, but I think people usually go to files changed, which then just jumbles it all together. The next thing I did. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
So this next commit was basically about, because previously in the structure, everything was just in one folder, which I felt like kind of mixed together contents that were about the specification as well, versus like project comments about the licensing and the contribution guidelines, the code of conduct, all of that.
I would tend to concur. It was a defensible structure when what you had was a spec.md, but as we spread out other files, I could see the confusion arising.
Mhm. Yeah, and then related to that, this also I tried to like add some stuff to the README to just make the README like link to the other things appropriately and all of that. So again, like some formatting changes, hard wrapping the lines, fixing up a little bit, and then the the README. Basically, so we had some stuff that was previously in spec.md that specified, like, oh, we're following this ISO guide and we have this, reference model manuscript and things. So I, put those in the README, provided some information on contributing, including, suggesting, hey, maybe you want to join the working group meetings if you have things to discuss, link to the code of conduct, link to the license. Ooh, review stack. Oh, that's nice. Just saw the comment. So, and then, some file moves. And then also I wanted to, previously we had this header that said version 1.0. I felt like, I don't know if 1.0 actually makes sense given that we're still actively drafting it. So I made this little table instead at the top and I'm calling it 0.1.
Yeah.
Happy to quibble on
0.1 feels about right to me also. Yes.
So, oh, and then there was just a little grammatical thing where you're missing the, are used.
Okay.
So, again, this was just kind of organization and fix up stuff.
Structure.
Yeah. And then, oh yeah, I realized that maybe the patch number doesn't make sense when we're talking about a text document and like there's not like a semantic notion of patching.
So you no, this is the reason I'm sort of chuckling over here is you've just illustrated one of the classic examples of not with what you intended to do, but with what you mechanically did. You've illustrated with the classic examples of why component name version are terrible identifiers, because one of the examples I'll often use is to suppress or not to suppress the .0 micro release, because some people will and some people won't.
Right. Yeah. No, the patch number I think is always sort of a odd one out, and compared to major and minor. Okay, so this next one, this actually was meaningful, and this was something I'd actually previously opened at a separate issue and figured I would just fix here. There's like an awkward double negative in this sentence that seems to imply that everyone will be held responsible for identifying patent rights. This was an error that I think either we copied from Microsoft's SCIM documents or that they copied from this. I have no idea of the history to say which, but it was the only other project I could find that had the exact same error. But yeah, so instead of no party shall not be held responsible, remove the not, no party shall be held responsible, because that's the actual original intended clause.
Yep.
And then, some further fix up. So really, I mean, those first three commits are just all about structure, grammar, formatting. And then we get into the actual sort of first meat of it, which is taking a pass at doing an actual introduction to the specification.
Yeah, and some of these things that you've made as changes, I've actually thought a great deal about, because you basically focused on reproducibility of identifiers, which I think is the sort of key bit. What I've been previously referring to as canonical, and I do like that.
Yeah, and we could, if we want to use the word canonical over reproducible, that is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm happy to
no, I think
reproducible
better. I think reproducible better captures things. Occasionally, there are pathologies of one's former life may sometimes migrate forward, and physicists love the word canonical. We love it. It's our favorite word. It's the binky of physics words. We snuggle it. It makes us feel warm and safe. And that's probably may have been why that wandered into the language. I think your reproducible is clear.
Okay, good. Yeah, so this, I tried to both capture a bit of the why, but actually I think starting more with just an explanation of the what. So this is really similar to and like building on the notes that did sort of kick off this discussion about identifiers, manifests, dependency graphs. And so basically tried to start with, hey, okay, here's what an identifier is. Once you have those, here's how you can get the manifest. And then if you have a manifest, you can have the dependency graph. And then sort of wrapping it up with, what do you get from having all of these things together? And so, give an example of like, if you have an artifact dependency graph, then you can exactly identify when two artifacts are produced with exactly identical inputs. And if they vary, you can identify exactly how they vary and everything else in the graph that that is impacted by that. As well as a little mention of that you can connect this to SBOM information about dependencies or provenance information from SALSA attestations, and overall get this, just a more granular view of what's happening in your supply chain. So, yeah, I mean, that was sort of structurally what I was going for here. And then, of course, we can. I would love for people to review the actual language and give feedback on that.
I've given this at least a once through and was very pleased. Something like this deserves a couple passes through, though, in my opinion. So I'll go back and reread it, especially now that I've realized that you've broken things up so nicely in patches. It makes commenting on the commits much easier.
Yeah, and then there's one more commit after this, which was actually we had talked about this PR a little bit in last week's discussion, and then I'd actually forgotten, Ed, that you had done a draft intro as well, which is funny because I'd given comments on it while writing this.
Well,
and it slipped my mind.
Okay, and so you've incorporated some elements of that as well here.
Yeah, so I wanted to go through and make sure that if there were important points that were being addressed there, I didn't want that to be lost in this other draft.
No, I do appreciate that, and I very much appreciate the effort here. As you've probably noticed, writing is not my forte. I'm a man of many skills. That is not the leading one, and so I'm so incredibly pleased that you took all the effort to pick up the pin here. Now, I suspect that this would then imply some downstream changes as well that we would need to make further on in the spec as we define things a little bit greater precision. But we can get to those. We can get to those as we get to those.
Yeah, and I think that the disposition we had after last week's discussion was basically, we've got some stuff in flight right now that is affecting different parts of the spec in ways that doesn't exactly map to the new language that we've worked out and sort of the new, kind of way of talking about it. Our disposition was to still merge those things and then to do a separate pass through and say, okay, where can we update the language and, make it all fit.
Yeah, we're having a certain amount of mechanical challenge there. So I've spoken with Ava about this. So Ava had turned on branch protection requiring two simultaneous approvers, which is a fantastic practice for communities of certain scale, particularly communities of certain scale and contention. But we may not be at a scale where that makes sense. And I also need to go back and re-click the invite button when we moved orgs. Quite a few people who had write access to the org did not, for whatever reason, again, I miss these all the time too, so it's not a criticism, accept the invite. And so I'll go resend those as well. So we're having a little mechanical issue there. I think Ava probably agrees with moving down to only requiring one approver. As a matter of personal taste, my red line is putting aside the issues that can happen in larger communities that you have to watch for, but the thing that I find works almost everywhere is it's almost never a good idea to merge your own patch.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I've got a half a dozen examples where it was the right move, where the branch was broken and I was the only one with the mechanical capacity at the time, but it's a very extreme scenario where it makes any sense to merge your patch.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would say that my most sort of, own goal, error introducing that didn't need to be there was the times where I decided, I'm not going to wait and tried to merge my own thing.
It is Murphy's favorite thing. So yeah. I do apologize. I have to go drop here at the bottom of the hour, but do please feel free to continue without me. And I will see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you very much. And see you next week.
Oh, wait, hang on. Let me pass the host on to you before I leave, because I'm currently making host.
Otherwise the meeting will close. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So I've made you host. Now I can leave.
All right. So, I feel like basically that's like the run through this PR. Obviously still happy for, if anyone else wants to take a read through of it and give feedback on the draft. Certainly I think.
I
Oh,
do
go
need
ahead.
to go through this in detail. I think like everything I see is basically good as far as I'm concerned, though there's obviously always niggles. I think I guess the like, I know that this is a statement of the design as it currently stands, but the like artifact dependency graph singularity stuff seems to be the most it seems like the part of the spec that's most likely to change.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, definitely I think that we're in a state of, writing having this draft spec, but I think also still kind of scoping out exactly what information goes into these manifests, which then affects, what you can or can't use them for, or even, what they will be sort of a good fit for, like what's going to be easy, what's going to be hard.
And also whether they get embedded in the output artifacts, because that's the
right. Yeah, the reproducibility question, sort of the connection there has been challenging. And I know that, there's been the discussion of like the hard versus soft reproducibility and there's unresolved stuff there that's going to be impactful.
But I think having the kind of current state in the document is good, like, because then we have a point of reference to discuss.
Yeah.
I had a bunch of notes on the original spec, and I was wondering if you had seen that.
Yeah, which do you know which issue or if that was in a PR?
It was an issue. Let me have a look.
Okay, general spec comments.
Yeah, 36.
Excuse me. All right. Oh yeah, I think this is an interesting point. Having the main spec that describes the mandatory stuff, and then annexes about using it in practice. I could imagine that, because I know right now we've got annexes that are basically about, if you're going to generate it into a document. I think we're going to have an embedding annex, or we have an embedding annex. It could be interesting to have an annex that is about some sample use cases specifically. That could be an interesting thing to have. Yeah,
or what do they call it? Like when a spec has what's the terminology? Like a non-normative, examples or something like that, even if it's embedded in it, but making it very clear which text is part of the spec and which text is just sort of giving color to the spec. Yeah, it's sort of the interesting thing of like the difference between the specification and like a guide or tutorial, and like, okay, what are you actually going to do with this spec, and what's the use going to be? Yeah, I mean, I still think like having like I think I raised this a long time ago, of like having a set of case studies of like kinds of things that you would want to be able to do that become much easier if OmniBOR exists. Right. As a way of grounding a lot of this conversation in specific use cases. And it like obviously doesn't mean that those are the only uses you can put it to, but they are the uses that have to be supported in order for the spec to be considered successful. Yeah, no, I think actually that makes a lot of sense. I think it makes it easier to kind of pitch OmniBOR to other people, to be able to say, hey, you should care about this thing, whether that's, when I say other people, whether that's working with, let's say, compiler teams to say, hey, can we build in support for this and generate these manifests, or if it's trying to get users or potential sort of consumers of the information to care about it. Having pre-written and sort of collectively developed, and we'd like think that they're sort of good, the quality is where it needs to be.
descriptions of the use cases actually can be a really useful thing to point to. I know that for software bills of material, at least like in the government space, which is, kind of where I live and work, that there had been a lot of work on creating that sort of thing for SBOMs and a number of different documents that were sort of describing for audiences of different level of technical knowledge, essentially like what do you get for having an SBOM, and what can you do with that? I think could imagine a similar thing here being pretty important.
Yeah, though I do feel like it should be the other way around. It's not like once you've got an SBOM, this is what justifies its existence. It should be, here's a high level problem that could be solved in any number of ways, but here's a particular solution, and this is why it's a good solution.
Right. Okay. So starting from the problem rather than the product. That makes sense. Yeah.
Because, and I do think, I think there's like the artifact dependency graph singularity stuff, like in one sense, like there's a particular set of uses for which that's desirable, but it's also like if you're interested in working out what the contribution of a source file that has a known vulnerability in it has to your final built artifact, then that singularity is actually potentially a negative. Because it means, it's definitely conservative. It means that source file will definitely have an effect on your final artifact or your final manifest sort of content ID, but it may not actually be relevant. It comes back to this whole filtering and convergence and divergence thing that I've been going on about.
Yeah. Well, it sort of, as a kind of conceptualizing the idea here, it makes me think of kind of an analogy to like perceptual hashing, where you want to have, for example, let's say, thinking of like content identification stuff or identifying like child abuse material, where there's, interest in having the ability of like hashing images or videos in a way that, if someone has modified them with, let's say, mirroring it or cropping part of it or doing other sorts of image manipulation stuff to it, that it could still be identified through sort of perceptual hashing. Like that's the basic concept of it, because you're wanting to permit fuzziness in the hashing algorithm to kind of be resistant to changes that are irrelevant to the core thing that you're trying to actually detect.
Yeah. Yeah, and going back to my issue 36, I think I haven't actually read through carefully, but the original version of the spec had a kind of circular relationship between the definitions and the spec itself. Like some things were defined in definitions and then also defined in the specifications, and something like, it seems to me that the definition should be a glossary of like, here's the terminology that we're using, but don't, what's the right way of phrasing this? Certainly any kind of words that we're using, like regular English words that we're using in a specific way, should be defined in the definitions, so that like the fact that we're using them in a particular way should be highlighted.
Okay.
But the like it's sort of, having your axioms and having your proofs, like you something is either an axiom or a proof, so you should maybe restrict the definitions to the terms that you're drawing on for the rest of the spec.
I see. So rather than having in the definitions section the terms of art that were that are OmniBOR specific, that we're like introducing in the spec, having it be sort of a place for the terms of art that we are using from the broader sort of, context of software security and open source software and whatever else, these sort of, relevant concepts, but that separate from the things that we're introducing, like, artifact identifier or dependency graph, things like that. I mean, do I have that right in terms of like what you're suggesting?
Yeah, so like terms like build tool and build action and things like that. I mean, one of my other comments is that we use there's a bit of a confusion of like, I feel like we use the term build tool, which is a noun, as a stand-in for the action that a build tool performs. And so it would be nice to distinguish that. But in either case, build tools don't explicitly turn up in the data model. They're sort of implied presence. And so that would be a reasonable thing to define, because we need to talk about build tools and their effects in order to describe the other things.
Right. I wonder, would a reasonable path in terms of getting to fixing up that that section, would it be kind of we write the rest of the main body of the spec and you then are sort of going through and saying like, okay, what are the terms of art that we feel like we're using here? And first asking the question, are we using them consistently and correctly? So like if we're using build tool, like are we being consistent in what we mean by that in different sections? As well as, as you're describing, are we ever using build tool in a context where, build action or build process might make more sense? And then pulling out those terms of art that are sort of our, inputs from this outside world instead of like the things that we're coming up with ourselves, and then putting those in the definitions section.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so I put some comments here. It was quite a while ago, so I've forgotten exactly what I said, but I will do another pass over your here and just sort of highlight things that I think perhaps should be not as part of definitions or something. Because I mean, there's also a question of like, should we both have definitions and a glossary?
Do we have both right now?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, to a certain extent, they like the way I think of it, and maybe this is just like overly nitpicking, is that the definitions are the things that, like, they are your axioms. They're the things that you depend on. You're using these terms in a specific way in order to describe the aspects of the spec. And so if they're not part of the definitions, they're kind of like unmoored. Whereas the glossary is sort of like a helpful document that if I'm going through this and I don't know what this term means, I can go to the glossary and look anything up, and it will give me a quick kind of summary of what the thing is, and then a reference to the spec where it's actually defined or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, it may be worthwhile to have both. I wonder in the case of terms which would appear in both, if we would sort of delegate to say like, oh, see the definition for this thing, and then, if we want to provide additional context in the glossary, like we can. Just in terms of avoiding the possibility of like duplication or inconsistency between the, the definition in the definitions section and the description in the glossary section. But,
I mean, the glossary might more be like an index. It's just like a place where you can, like, I run across this term and what does it mean? How does it fit in with the rest of the thing? I can go to the glossary and then it says, oh, this is defined in the definitions, or this is, it's defined in the spec.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that could be good. I think in general, I'm agreeing with your sense of how to rework the definitions.
And yeah, then the tool thing, like that specifically comes from, since tools themselves may be generated, like you may have a binary of a compiler or a code generator or something like that that's built as part of your build process. And so the tool is an artifact like anything else, but when you use that tool as part of constructing a new artifact, you're using the action of that tool. And so what an artifact manifest represents is the action of executing a tool. And if you use the tool, like the term tool, as a stand-in for the action that the tool performs, then it could get confusing to think about that, because you have a node in the graph, which is an artifact which represents that tool, but also it could be invoked arbitrary number of times in order to produce other artifacts.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it raises a question of, I suppose, of tool identity as well. Because the tool, you know, there might be different implementations of the tool itself, but, you know, if it's a generated tool, you might have, you know, slight differences in the tool that's generated, which then could be the cause of differences in the output of the tool as well.
Right, and well, we have the more general problem as well in the spec, is that because the inputs don't ever refer to tools or the outputs, then any two invocations of any tools that happen to share the same inputs will produce the same manifest. So the only way you can distinguish them, like with, you know, distinguish them is just by what artifact they're embedded into. And then you have to kind of guess from the content of that artifact as to what the tool was that got you there.
Right.
And that's one of the motivations for having the input tagging, is that so that you could put the tool as a form of input and be able to distinguish it from like your source files or other kinds of input.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah. I will say, this is helping me better appreciate the some of the points you've been making in the convergence divergence discussions and you know, things related to that. All right, I think let's keep going, and I'm gonna spend some time thinking more about this and looking more at this issue specifically. And then, okay, it looks like this is kind of a term on or discussion of terminology, which I think, you know, I wonder if there are specific points in here you think are worth covering. We can. I think maybe this, you know, it's been sort of covered at least in part by the more recent language discussions.
One of the other comments I made was the use of the word child, which I found confusing and ambiguous. And
right,
we should just restrict ourselves to inputs and outputs.
Yeah, is child kind of a holdover from when we talked about trees, not
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah, input, not child. Yeah, so I think that'll be something that, you know, haven't yet gone through the remainder of the spec to kind of fix up the language, and I'm gonna, I think, hold off on that until we've got some of these other in-flight things merged. But I do I'm with you that I think removing the word with the word child, I'm replacing it with input, is going to be a lot clearer than.
Well, I mean, just because the whole parent-child analogy, like parent is the ancestor, but here the children are the inputs, so they
right.
have the sort of ancestor parent role. So it's just confusing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Oh, and I see as well bore rather than bomb in the note there. Yeah, I think that this is worth covering just sort of in general how we encode the you know, case of when you have a manifest for an artifact. Because you know, I think it sounds like maybe we're interested in attaching some additional data as well, possibly. So we might want to have a sort of discussion of what the syntax is for whenever we're attaching kind of metadata onto an entry for a particular artifact, whether it's, you know, hey, that artifact has a manifest, or, you know, hey, here's some additional metadata that we care about for this particular artifact.
Right. And yeah.
Okay, yeah, more information on the ordering. I definitely agree there, because the ordering is obviously going to be, you know, becomes, you know, it is relevant to the artifact identifier of the manifest itself. And so if we want this stuff to be sort of independently reproducible by different parties, everyone needs to have clear agreement on the exact sort order of whatever's being output. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's just a few things that I think are implied, but we should be stating more explicitly, like I think the implication is that this is all text, and so the identifiers are hex encoded, right?
Mm.
And even just syntactic things, like we are relying on line breaks as syntactic delimiters rather than fixed size records or something like that.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah, anyway, I need to kind of both reread what I wrote on this and then sort of cross-reference it with your PR.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is really good though. It's given me, sorry, I know I've gone kind of quiet. I think it's given me a lot to think about, which is good. Yeah, I agree that there's still a number of things in here that ought to be addressed even after we kind of merged the stuff that's in flight right now. So, and just keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure we at least have an opportunity to discuss if there's any of these remaining things. These have all kind of been open for bid. I know that we kind of have had some prior discussions on them. Are there open things that folks would want to discuss on some of these? These links are basically all kind of tied to the open PRs that we currently have. So we have this new spec, prior draft of the new spec, which I think probably end up closing, is this one incorporates the stuff that we care about out of this one. Besides that, there's this discussion about when to generate the OmniBOR file, adding back Annex B for ELF embedding, and adding no embed to the spec. Does anyone feel like there are open things to discuss for these?
Is there anything still open on the Annex B thing? Couldn't we just merge that?
Let's find out.
I mean, there was some naming stuff around that, but I think the conclusion we came to last week was just we should merge it as is and then do a
Thanks.
renaming pass over the whole spec.
Yeah, okay, so some language stuff.
I guess we are converging on like some word phrase involving the word manifest for this thing, so we should probably just make that change and before landing this.
Yeah, well, it looks like separately we have the issue of okay, see, there's two approving, but I think I'm not actually on the org, so my approval doesn't count in terms of the merging ability.
Okay, I think I can do that.
All right.
Should I just merge it?
I think so. Yeah, I think it just would need an approving review, and then I think other than that, it's ready to merge, and then we can fix up things after the fact.
If you send it to me, I can also approve, or if you link me rather, but
Sure,
that would be
I'll drop
only
it in the
one out
chat.
of two.
Yeah, well, I think because we have one from Ava right now, so we just need one more.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay. Do we merge branches or squash?
Yeah, I guess I haven't looked to see what we've been doing previously, if we've been squashing or just merging or even rebasing.
It would be pity to squash your PR because you've gone to the effort of breaking it up into nice separate commits and giving each one commentary, and squashing would just eliminate all of that.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what's like what we're set up to do. Okay, cool. I see the approval.
I do think GitHub being such a dumpster fire for stacks that people do tend to squash and not really give much consideration to the intermediate diffs. So, or
Yeah.
intermediate bits.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'll say like if mine gets squashed, that's not the end of the world. I think especially if the combined commit message still incorporates all of the commentary from the individual commit messages, it'll become, harder to sort of forensically go and like review if you want to look back in history and see the changes that were made. But they will be there and the descriptions will still be there at least. All right, so we're merging on the Annex B stuff. I wasn't sure if the like these kind of two other discussions, the no embed mode and the generating the file, if those had been resolved or not, or if they had.
I think the no embed one is still definitely. I don't actually feel like we've had a proper discussion about that yet.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that there's some like that this open comment. Yeah, it looks like there's some open stuff. So this one,
to me, I don't think the no embed, like it's not just a mode. Like it's a very fundamental change to the whole design.
Yeah.
And so like if we want to support both embedding and not embedding, that's two very distinct modes, and I'm not quite sure how well they like even work together. I mean,
Yeah.
it might do, but it needs a lot of thought. And so I think this conversation is a bigger scoped one than this PR.
Yeah.
And as far as the like when to generate, I mean, I'm taking this sort of fairly abstract approach that the using the file system to store this stuff is a specific concrete implementation, but that may well be the most common one, but doesn't seem to be like, I mean, from a practical point of view, it needs to be well defined just so that there's something for tool builders to work against. And I mean, my original stance, which I still kind of hold to, is that I feel like the spec should define an abstract interface to like what the data storage is for all of these objects, and then have a separate annex that talks specifically about how it should be stored in files, and then the details of exactly where and when that happens is part of that annex, rather than being something that's embedded into the core part of the spec.
Yeah, I do personally agree with that as well. I think it is sort of a cleaner separation and delineating these two kind of contexts where the data is going to be stored in the way in which that's going to affect both how you're sort of building it, but also how it's being consumed. Perhaps even within those annexes, a description of the trade-offs with the different sort of options if you're going to embed versus have in an adjacent file. Looking at the time, I realize I'm going to need to drop in a minute or two. So I think as it stands, these two PRs are still rightly open. So we've sort of got the two intro PRs, which should be resolved soon, and the alpha embedding PR, which seems like is going to be merged pretty soon. And from there, next steps, I think it's going to be discussion about these two things. Probably ongoing discussion about the convergence divergence issue and reproducibility impacts, as well as I intend to go through and do a pass on just the language and sort of updating things to the terminology, based on our sort of new terms we have for things.
Yep. Okay. Cool. And I will all right, I'll promise to do a pass over your PRs as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I definitely appreciate any feedback. So all right, I mean, I think that's it. Thanks everyone, and see you next week.
Well.